So Michelle, tell me about this docket number FDA 2021Z0025. You shared this the other day, and what are we looking at?
Yep. So this is the FDA's final response to a rule that was published mid-January. And the rule was about proposed to down classify nearly 90 devices to either class 1 or class 2 and make them 510K exempt. And what's significant about it is that most of these had a high risk, safety risk for them to be considered for down classification. So I got really passionate about this project, and I took every single one of these and analyzed it against the FDA databases and made a giant spreadsheet out of it. And I posted on LinkedIn. I encourage people to read, educate themselves, comment. And 39 people commented on the rule between January and March when the comment period closed. And of the 39, 30 were from my campaign on LinkedIn. And it was just a great example of you getting to have a voice and your voice getting heard, because the Federal Register withdrew this proposed rule and made it null and void. And not only did they do that, they could have done that fairly quietly, but they did it with, this was one of the most scathing and critical withdrawals that I've ever seen of proposed rules. And some of my favorite comments were, we did not find any evidence that HHS consulted with, otherwise involved, or even notified FDA before issuing the notice. The notice was published without adequate scientific report. The notice contained errors and ambiguities. The notice is otherwise flawed. HHS has received dozens of inquiries about the January 15th notice. That's us, people. We're the dozens. Then it calls out in at least 3 or 4 places. For example, there were many comments, as noted in several comments, as some comments noted. And then it concluded with, these errors and ambiguities make it difficult or impossible in some circumstances to discern which class 2 device the notice is even proposing to exempt, as noted by some commentators. For these reasons, HHS and FDA are withdrawing the proposed exemptions.
Oh, wow.
So
that's pretty damn big.
I'm very proud of this. This is going to go in my career scrapbook for sure.
Wow.
So
each of the devices that were on that terrific list, and I remember we talked about and worked on it together a little bit, all of them are staying right where they were.
Yes. And the 7 that were already like class 1 that required a 510K, they're pulling those out and analyzing them on a separate bill.
That's fantastic. In just a sentence or two, for those who weren't familiar with the campaign and exactly what the proposal was, what was proposed and what did you stop from happening? Stop from happening?
So there were several moderate to fairly high risk devices that they were proposing to remove from basically most of FDA direct oversight, meaning it make them 510K exempt, where FDA didn't have to review the performance data. And this included like catheters that go in the interstitial space between your brain and your skull. Like, I don't know about you, but I would want FDA to verify the performance and the safety data and the sterility data and the biocompatibility data of anything that's going to go next to my brain. My favorite, antimicrobial surgical masks that require currently about $500,000 worth of testing to demonstrate that they are safe and effective, were on the list. And a lot of cancer diagnosis devices. Yeah, it was just totally nonsensical, the devices that they were proposing. And
fantastic.
They did it just by doing a mod database of if the devices had killed anybody. They didn't look in the databases to see if they'd hurt anybody. And one of the devices that hadn't killed anybody had hurt 72 people.
This is why we do this, huh? That's just a fantastic story. Thank you so much on behalf of the industry. Now, I have promoted Peter Argondizzo, my buddy, to join us. And we're going to get to the scheduled programming today, which is about MDR and about the havoc it's going to wreak on your translations. So this is another one of those two great tastes that taste great together kind of commercials, where I love bringing my friends together to collaborate on something and make more than would have been done individually. So friends, take it away. I think you have a slide deck. I'm not sure who's gonna.
Thanks for inviting me, Joe. I'm excited to participate with Michelle. I hope this is almost as exciting as that. That's huge. That was a great accomplishment by Michelle. I think that's phenomenal. I'm glad we opened with that, actually. And I think it dovetails really well into what we're talking about today in terms of regulation. So
Okay.
I'm driving, so if I can
Yeah,
share,
please.
great. I'll go ahead and get started. All right. All
Okay.
right, just to make sure, can you see the slides okay?
We sure can.
All right, outstanding. So this is part of a series that we're doing this year. You know, we were also focused on the negative aspects of, obviously, of COVID. I mean, many of us were impacted both personally and professionally. So we wanted to do a series of positive or forward-looking webinars, and I'm glad that we're getting things kicked off with this one on the MDR, which is something that's near and dear to a lot of our clients. I also want to just throw out there that we are going to be inserting 2 polls, and we use the Poll Everywhere app, and you can hit it in one of 3 different ways. You can either go download the app, either from Google Play or Apple App Store, or you can just text Peter A961 to the number 22333, or you can just go to a browser and go to pollev.com/Peter A961. And those instructions will appear again at the top of the screen once we get to a poll question. So I'll leave that on screen just for a second. But Michelle,
is it case sensitive?
No, not at all.
Okay.
And then once we have the question on screen is when you'll be able to vote. So there's 2 different polls.
Hey, check that out. Okay, so hold on a sec. I want to show folks that I sent that text and I got this message with a link, and then I'll be able to take the poll. So cool, you taught me something new. Thank you very much.
Great. All right.
Is it free? Does it cost anything?
There's actually a free level of service that limits the number of guests. We're just at the one above that. I think we can have up to 700 participants on this one. So
okay, thanks. All right.
Great. All right, well, let's get started. I wanted to introduce Michelle. Michelle Lott, who I'm very fortunate to be presenting with today. And we're going to make this very conversational. As you can see from Michelle's credentials, she knows her stuff. If it has to do with the FDA and regulations, you definitely want to look up her company. But Michelle, I'll let you introduce yourself if you could talk a little bit about your background.
Yep. So I'm Michelle. I own Lean REQA. We specialize in helping startups and small to mid-sized companies figure out and make sense of FDA requirements. You know, I am a strong believer that regulatory and quality aren't one size fits all. And yeah, so I've been on the FDA advisory committee. Fun fact, I have a background in forensics, and that's how I got my start actually into medical devices. I moved from forensics into auditing. So yeah, so I just love investigating. I love unraveling mysteries and problems, and such as the FDA and the EU right now.
Great, thank you, Michelle. And a little bit about myself. My name is Peter Argondizzo. I'm the founder at Argo Translations, and I started in the medical device world 27 years ago. Argo's been around 26 years ago, but I was fortunate enough to be a project manager at Marquette Electronics. That company was later absorbed by GE Healthcare, but I was managing the translation of all sorts of devices, different carts, treadmills that they made, bedside monitors. So it was really a great experience. Once we started Argo, things really took off, and This is my, McDonald's used to have the 88 billion served. This is our version of that. Argo's managed over 50,000 projects and over 300 million words in over 800 languages. My background in education is in finance and HR, but basically Argo does one of two things. We either help clients to generate more revenue by connecting them to different marketplaces all over the world, or we help with greater connection to their employees. So anywhere where there's a barrier of language, we help to eliminate those barriers. So,
did you seriously take Italian in college?
I did add GPA booster there because probably like my good friend Andre, we spoke at home, and then that's an awesome way to boost your GPA.
Did you show up for class?
I did, because my professor was really tough, and because he knew I was doing a boost of GPA maneuver there, he was really hard on me. I mean, like all the time. It was actually the maneuver kind of failed, actually, a little bit.
Did it hurt your GPA?
No, I ended up doing well, but he really pushed me. Like I thought I was going to coast, and
You were
I still
conjugating things that you never thought were conjugatable.
Oh yeah, it was great. I'm glad I was able to sharpen up my Italian skills for sure.
We had I'm sorry to indulge this, but we had a lyric in a Warden Follies skit. It was, I was a CPA, I was an M&A, but I took accounting anyway. That was a GPA.
Yes, very appropriate.
Yeah.
Great. So, all right, so just a reminder on the Poll Everywhere app. Hopefully you've all been able to activate that. So I thought we would start with this poll. So how ready are you for the MDR? Choices A, B, C, or D. We'll give everyone a minute to respond. Joe, was that you? What does MDR stand for again?
No, in fact, I clicked on the thing and I'm not quite there yet. Participate, and so maybe I clicked on the wrong link. No.
We'll leave it open for a second. So obviously, the maybe Michelle, you could speak a little bit to the delays. Obviously with COVID, the MDR was pushed out. Where are we on that now? May 26, 2021 is supposedly the date now. From what you're understanding, is that the date?
Well, on my countdown timer, we're down to, I think, 42 days. And it's very confusing because they pushed it out for two reasons. I think COVID was a convenient excuse, but they weren't ready. The EU itself, the Commission, wasn't ready with the infrastructure that they needed to carry out their own regulations. Now, over this past year, they have continued to get ready. They've continued to issue the guidance documents that they committed to. They're not done. They haven't fully met their commitment that were supposed to be in place in May a year ago. UDMED is not fully implemented yet. That was supposed to be in place a year ago. So they have made great strides. They're still not ready. It's a question if they're going to move forward as is or if they're going to push it out again. But I don't think that COVID is going to be an excuse anymore.
Well, it's interesting based on the results. For a little bit, no one even had chosen the more than ready choice, but it looks like that's kind of the minority. So it's amazing that we're even haven't even started prepping. So that's a pretty interesting stat for our viewers.
I have I want to say it's a joke, but it's not a joke. It's a joke, but it's reality at the same time. And I call myself like the regulatory grief counselor. And, one of the stages of grief is denial. And in my personal and professional opinion, I see, haven't even started prepping is the bulk of industry right now. So I think this spread is very reflective of all of industry, actually.
What do you think the real consequence will be?
They're going to have to pull their products off the market in Europe.
And do you think that's really going to happen?
I do. It's a real thing.
Starting June. Sorry, you can't sell. And there's not going to be any kind of industry like, oh, please, we need more time. And some kind of commission saying, well, I mean, we can't have 50% of the products leave.
The people who already have certificates are allowed to continue to market their products until, I believe, 24. So but it's that
anyone new.
You can't continue to get audited for your CE mark under the MDD. So your quality management systems are going to have to transition like immediately before your next notified body audit, regardless if your technical file has transitioned or not.
Okay.
That's my understanding.
Well,
Could have,
it's been a
yeah,
while
huge
since we
impact.
talked about it, but I remember the crush of work that notified bodies have, and trying to find one that can even accommodate you at this point and the like. It's going to be a challenge.
All right, great. Well, with that, let's jump in. And by the way, we're going to make the slides available. And I think we'll have the recording as well, Joe. Is that right? In case. Okay, wonderful. So we're going to go through the articles, and what we're hoping to do is, obviously, this is not the complete article. We tried to boil it down a little bit, but then we're going to further boil it down. And Michelle's going to help us understand the articles, and we've organized them in a way that they match up to certain solutions or things you should consider relative to translation. So Michelle, why don't you go ahead and get started? As you say slide, I'll just move through the articles. We'll start with 10 and 11, I guess.
Yeah. So let me kind of back up at a higher level. Thanks to my tool that I got from Regulatory Globe and my friend Michael, I've got this massive spreadsheet that compares the MDD to the MDR, so I can see where the gaps or alignment is. And the MDR uses the word language 13 times. And of those 13, 10 of them have no comparison or counterpart in the MDD. So there are only 3 places that the MDD discussed language that are similar or the same to the way MDR discussed language. So some of them so these are specific to the actual manufacturer. The manufacturer must be accompanied by all appropriate, the device must be accompanied by all appropriate instructions for use, the packaging, and the language where the device is sold. That one is, similar in terms of compliance to the MDD. We all expected that. But then the manufacturers also have to provide all the information and documentation necessary to demonstrate the conformity of the device in the official union language, and that's for each member state. Next slide. And this is another place where the MDR became more pervasive, is now the language requirements also apply to the authorized representative. So now you've got a set of language requirements for the manufacturer, but then you also have a set of language requirements for the authorized representative. So they, upon request, have to provide all of that same information and documentation in that language that was requested. And so this means your authorized representative now needs language and translation skills beyond just the country that they are located in.
Great. I mean, and that represents a huge body of work. I mean, especially for someone, for a firm who maybe hasn't done translation previously, even if they've maybe not done it domestically, right? There's some work that some of the med device manufacturers we work with will do domestically in terms of IFUs or trying to reach markets inside of the US. So imagine now you're going into the EU and you're faced with all these member states. It's a big deal. And if you haven't already started to vet a translation service provider, here's some things that we hope to give you that will make things easier for you. I'd look for ISO registration. Depending on your device, you may or may not be required to work with someone who has the 13485 registration. You should also look at what are they doing for quality assurance in terms of their platform. Do they have the proper documentation? How are they handling corrective actions internally? And I would suggest looking at their quality assurance manual. I think that's maybe a really quick way to see how committed are they to a QA process. What does their manual look like? Does it look over templated? Like if you looked and asked 10 other agencies, would they have exactly the same quality assurance manual that they picked up from some consultants? And I would also maybe ask if you could talk about any findings that were discovered either in their last internal audit or their last formal audit, and if there were any corrective actions or RFIs and how those were handled. And I would say just really be careful of window dressing. I have some friends not in med devices, but that are ISO 9001 for manufacturing, and they do a bit of window dressing. I mean, they do ISO, this is the way that I say this, they do ISO 3 days out of the year, the 3 days before the auditor shows up. And those are people that are not taking having these registrations seriously, because in our mind, it's an opportunity for improvement. When we adopted the 3 different registrations we have, it was really an opportunity for us to improve if you embrace it in that way. And one of the things you might want to look at as well that we've run into with a lot of procurement departments and internal regulatory departments, they might have an approved supplier list. So are you coordinating with them to make sure that you're onboarding the translation vendors in the way that works internally? In larger organizations, that's a bit of work. And I would also suggest either creating jointly with your translation vendor that you choose or on your own a set of standard operating procedures, because you really need to set the bar. Like, what are we doing for translation? Are we allowing machine translation? Gosh, I hope not if you're working with medical devices. Are we?
Not everybody's using Google Translate, Peter?
Oh, I have stories. I have stories, and you'd be shocked, even with some stuff that could kill a person. That people think, oh, let's just use Google, it'll be fine.
So Peter and I became friendly back more than a decade ago now. When I was at Cardiac Science, he was my chosen vendor, and Paul Barker, remember him, did an exhaustive search for the right translation agency, and it was extremely competitive, and I'm really pleased that you won. We've become friends. But I do remember back in 2008, when we were thinking about translating our website into multiple languages, I was like, there's this, button on Google that just translates the whole page. I mean, do we really have to? And the answer was yes, because getting a few words wrong can be life-threatening.
Well, one of my first experiences with mistranslations was at Baxter, and we made infusion sets with the extruded tubing, and I just happened to be doing an audit with somebody that was a native German speaker, and we looked at an IFU and they were reading it in German. And they're like, yeah, so the word you used here for tube means garden hose. It was like, apparently there were 2 words for tube, and one of them was garden hose, not infusion, not deliver drugs to my body tube.
It can definitely happen, and we're going to talk a little bit about functional review, and there's a reason why all these steps exist, and it's to catch those kind of things. And lastly, on this set of recommendations, I would also say, as part of that SOP, are those expectations spelled out for your vendors? In other words, we expect translation, an independent editor. Here's here's an MSA that supports what we're doing. Is there a contract in place? These are all things that you should be thinking about. All right, moving on to Article 16.
Okay, so Article 16 is talking about the obligation of manufacturers, importers, distributors, and other persons. So you guys might be familiar with the term economic operators from MDR, but basically the whole supply chain, including distributors who private label your product, have restrictions around the way that they can use or retranslate the manufacturer's original material. And the distributors have to now have a quality management system around their procedures for translation when they are translating an original like an OEM product.
And then there's Annex 2, Roman numeral 2 from the technical documentation section, and that boils down to this.
Mm-hmm. So you guys know the technical documentation is basically the EU term for like your 510K or your PMA or whatever is the according submission that matches your product. So so this is a massive amount of documentation, and the labeling, instructions for use, and packaging information out of that technical documentation must be made available in the languages accepted by the member states where the device is sold.
Again, another large body of work, and kind of a different animal. Doing translation for packaging, I wanted to spend a little bit of time on that. That's usually a different tool set for the designers. Usually they're working either in InDesign or Illustrator or maybe even Photoshop. So you'll want to make sure there's a strategy in place on how are we going to handle the graphics that make up the packaging. The translation vendor should still use their translation memory tools, so that way they can reuse the material. We'll talk about translation memory a little bit in greater detail later, but just sort of the quick definition of it is that your translation vendor should be using a database that stores all of your translations. And the reason that's important is because all of you, of course, do releases or updates on your documentation or packaging. So something that you've translated previously should be stored so that in the future, you're only working on the differential. What does that do? That creates consistency. It creates shorter timelines, and of course saves you a bunch of money, which is going to be really important when you're faced with creating translations in 28 languages. So, make sure that that's part of the plan, and make sure it's discussed, openly discussed, and how it's going to be done. And then you should also make sure that on all these translations that are being created, that there's a full audit trail, because invariably someone's going to translate something as a tube as a garden hose, and you're going to want to research where the hell did that happen and why did it happen? So you'll want to have an audit trail on who was the translator, who was the editor, who worked on this project. So every project should be accompanied by a compliance document. And most companies will have that as part of their SOP, where they'll need to have that audit trail in place for every single project. And moving on to Article 18, which then sort of boils down to this.
This is another one of the new requirements in the MDR, and that's that implant cards have to be supplied to the patient directly that receive the implanted device. And the implant card has to have, obviously the key information, warnings, precautions, measures that they should take for both the patient and the healthcare professional should something go wrong, or any maintenance that needs to be done. Information about the expected lifetime, the necessary follow-up that they need to do, and any other information to ensure safe use of the device. And now this part is important, by the patient. And I think we'll talk about that on the next slide.
And then there's one more article that sort of builds into that.
Yep. So now all the declarations of conformity also have to be able to be, shall be translated into the language for the countries where the product is sold. And that's a new requirement as well.
And then this one sort of dovetails in, and I also thought was really interesting.
Mm-hmm. So now your CER has to basically have, that's your clinical evaluation report, has to have a summary that kind of goes with it, like an executive summary of the safety and clinical performance. And then that has to be written in a way that's clear to both the intended user and to the patient. So we're talking about the doctor or the healthcare practitioner that's dispensing the device, and to the lay person. And then this is going to have to be public in UTMed. So people will be able to look this up and read it like kind of in a freedom of information type way.
Michelle, I have a question for you on that, because this was the one that I thought was the most intriguing of the requirements. So if I were a manufacturer and I'm asking, Michelle, I think we need to modify our documentation, this seems so subjective. Who is the arbiter to decide that, yep, this looks pretty clear for a patient? Or my gosh, in prepping, you and I were chatting, what if the intended audience is a child? What if it's, one of these, the blood sugar monitors that maybe a child might use? Mm-hmm. How is that decided? It seems awfully arbitrary.
Well, arbitrary is a great word for MDR as a whole, actually, Peter. And unfortunately, and notified bodies will tell you this, nobody knows how the competent authorities are going to interpret or adjudicate these things, because they don't even agree amongst themselves. So a lot of this is, we're going to just figure it out as we all go. Not just the manufacturer, because the competent authorities are figuring it out, which means the notified bodies are trying to figure out what the competent authorities just figured out. And then that means the manufacturers are just trying to figure out what the notified bodies just figured out about how this is going to be interpreted and implemented. And, to your particular point about what if the IFU is for a child, we get back into that, how do you translate graphics? Because I would think for a child, you would want as many pictorials as possible, but most people have got labels or something underneath their pictures. How are you going to deal with that in the multiple languages?
Before you answer that, Peter, Luke, come on and ask your question, which is directly related.
The second question on liability.
Yeah,
Yeah, like if you have a translation of instructions for use, who is liable for translation errors? Is it the manufacturer?
And
definitely, I would think.
yeah, it's shared. I mean, really, the translation vendor could have some liability. Usually, so it's a really good question. So if you look at the legalese on most contracts for translation, usually what they'll say is the liability is limited to the value of the project. I mean, and of course, because that could be a death knell, right? But most translation providers will also have some form of errors and omissions insurance. So if they have errors and omissions insurance, it'll likely become an insurance claim. But I would imagine the client, as choosing that vendor, would also have some liability.
I would think that the client would be liable, and then he's going to come chase you
Absolutely.
and see what he can get out of you. So 26 years in business?
Yes.
How many times have you had to tap your omissions insurance?
Not once.
God bless you.
It's like, oh, sorry, you first.
Well, I just found in my notes from a meeting in October that I had with a notified body that had reviewed a client's CER, and they were talking about their experience with their competent authorities, and they said, and I quote, "I can only say it's messy."
They were honest, at least.
Yeah.
I do so totally agree with Michelle and Peter in all this. It is a mess here. And
You had another comment. Is it still relevant to bring up the loophole?
yeah. We tried to sell everywhere, and then we found out that it's not economically viable to do it in very small countries. So you end up not selling there, which is not good, of course. And we tried to do for some devices we had to try to take the loophole in 23B that says, well, I have to put on my glasses or else I cannot read it. By way of exception, instructions for use shall not be required for class 1 and class 2A devices if such devices can be used safely without any such instruction. So we tried that loophole very much. What then happens is that you have to prove that it can be used without any instruction. So you end up in a very big usability study where you try to prove that it can be used without instruction. And if then the outcome there is not as good as you like to be, you end up making instructions for use anyway. And also, even if you don't have instructions for use, you all, like we wanted to inform our users of what device they were having. So we didn't call them instructions for use, but we call them data sheets, but saying something about the device. And we made the mistake in the data sheet to say that it can be cleaned with a soft cloth and some detergent, mild detergent. And then they said, that's instructions for use, how to clean it. So now we, in the data sheet, we say it's mild detergents resistant. And we hope that the message gets through anyway. But it is a mess. I really agree. But for some people,
like it becomes here's a fun fact about the device. It's mild detergent resistant.
Yes, but I can imagine that you have some clients that have something that you can say, well, the use is self-explanatory, so why not? It is a tiny loophole, but you have to prove it with your usability study that it works, and of course the notified body has to agree as well. But anyway, it's always easier to state something and then let the notified body counter it with arguments than it is to have nothing and just say it's self-intuitive to use. So it is a way, but it's not. I cannot recommend it for a lot of things.
Thank you, Luke.
You're welcome. You can put me off again.
Thank you. Good question.
Hey, Rob. You are on mute, and Rob is going to be presenting an MDR topic, how and why MDR will wreak havoc on your next submission. That's scheduled for May 7th, but let me ask you, are you available a week from today? Because next week's speaker had to, so if you can, maybe we'll do back-to-back MDRs. You could let me know. But you had a question for Peter.
I should shoot myself if I say yes, though, but yeah, I can do it.
I don't need you to shoot yourself for it. I can. But while I have such a dramatic intro for those on the call.
It's like a Band-Aid, Joe. It's whether I
I know.
up and down or I
Okay,
pull it
so
off,
next week
I'm
we're gonna
up and
have Rob and I'll wear my Rob t-shirt. But go ahead and ask the question you had for Peter.
My question was, what kind of risk management system do you use for the translations?
Great. So Rob, good question. Good to see you again. So we use a system, the way that we mitigate risks in terms of the translation is having a solid process with a full audit trail. So every segment we translate for a client goes into a database and it has full revision control. So in other words, let's say one of our editors makes a change. We have the previous rev. And then if the translator comes back and makes a change, we have the previous rev. So we can track through exactly who's making changes in the database. So there's obviously business functionality there in terms of trying to save the clients money by reusing content, but there's also the mitigation of risk of understanding who did something. I mean, that's really how, if we had a corrective action relative to a translation, that's how we would have to work it, and then discover where was the root cause. Did they not understand the term? Maybe was the English written in a way that could be misunderstood? Perhaps it was vague. Well, if that's the case, that's still something we should have worked on. That should have been a question that went to the client for clarification. So once we find the root cause, and then we have to say, oh, we did this project in 18 languages. So now we have to notify the other 18 languages, hey, there was a discussion on this sentence. Here's what went on. Was there an issue that was caused in your languages as well? So then we might have to make a modification.
What's interesting is, Luke came on, Rob came on, they're asking about risk and liability. And I'm under the impression, and tell me if you kind of get this vibe, Peter, doing this for a living, but I think most medical device manufacturers are like, oh yeah, translations, we should translate this. And it's kind of an afterthought. And I think people's visual is like, oh, Italian. So we'll send this out to an agency. It's probably some woman sitting in her house in Italy and just like translating, and then sending it in. And we're like, okay. But there are real systems. This is a complex organization and there are real consequences. Can you talk to that a little bit? I'm trying to get a sense of, is this like oh yeah, translations, or no, you don't understand how serious and complex this is?
Well, great question. This was something that we talked about in prep with Michelle a little bit is, in terms of, vetting your vendors and how do the translation vendors vet their translators? Because it's an issue, and I'll tell you, over the years, I've seen a general degradation from some pretty large names of how they're choosing their vendors and where they're setting that bar. And quite frankly, a lot of it's been procurement driven. And, in order to do
we're looking for the cheapest solution.
Absolutely.
But translation's a translation. I could look in a dictionary. How hard can this be?
I always know we're in trouble when a client says, can you give me the cost to convert this manual into French? As if it were a mathematical equation that we just plug into a machine. In order to do these translations well, there's still a human component. Like, we're not at that point where MT, especially for a high risk project that typically like we see in medical devices, we're not there yet. But where we are is that we have these smart databases. So that then if we're smart about how we're creating the English and we're consistent, in other words, our tech writers or our marketing folks, Joe, I love you, Joe, don't reinvent the wheel every time they do a brochure or every time they write a manual. You're going to leverage that translation memory to the utmost. So you should see the costs going down anyway.
Yeah, I loved that. So when we figured out, you brought up your garden hose example, Michelle, once we figure out the right tube, Peter's system locks in. Every time we say tube, it's this word, and it's throughout all the systems. So
absolutely. And the systems, and again, there's a cost to have that system. Like, we can go forward to the point where if the client says, if I ever see this translation, which means garden hose, I'm going to lose it. Like, I'm going to be upset. We can actually do a negative connotation on a glossary term and allow it so that the translator can't even turn the job in if that term is used.
it's really interesting. Hey,
Yeah.
I have even more questions, and I suspect you have a number of slides to go. So let me.
We have a few more. Yeah, we can plow through.
Give us the prepared stuff, and I'll save the rest for now.
Okay, sounds great. The important part on this one is the register. So I think it's really important. So when we talk about register, we're talking about the reading level. So if the client has gone to that trouble of making this usable, again, using that example of a child, the patient's a child, it has to be expressed to the translation vendor that, hey, this document's written at a certain level for a reason. So maintain it. we do have the documents for the doctor, sure, that's written at a different level, but now we have these IFUs that are geared towards our patients, some our children, make sure to maintain that register. So that's important. And, as such, it strikes me as that, hey, we just keep adding on more requirements that require translation. So I thought one of the other recommendations we'd make here is that your vendor should have a tracking system. In other words, you should have the ability to see at any time, hey, how's my project? Where is it? So you should be able to log in and say, where are we? And there should be an archive for the files. I should have access, should be one of my rights that I have access to all my files. All the translations that I've created, I should be able to access them, as well as the financial information and the regulatory compliance docs. Because unfortunately, crises rarely happen at 2 p.m. They often happen at 10 p.m. So as much as I like to say we're very responsive, but sometimes we're not available at 10 p.m. But if we can make systems that are transparent, that allow our clients to log in, that's important. So I thought that was another really good requirement.
Before you go on, Peter, if you could go back, I just want to reiterate the importance of preserve the register, as Peter calls it, meaning the level of the reading level, because one of the biggest changes with MDR is that you have to consider the layperson and end user. It's for language, I think it's one of the most significant changes. And then you think about your translator house has to be able to be in 2 minds and 2 maybe even dialects, or like he was talking about connotations of the word. So I just wanted to re-emphasize that.
Great point. Thank you, Michelle. Then moving on to Article 41, that sort of boils down to this. And in this segment, we'll cover 41 and 52.
This all boils down to what each member state has designated as their official language. And so now this also has, we were talking about how MDR is pervasive, and it has rules for and regulations for all of the supply chain in terms of economic operators. It also has requirements for what the language requirements are for the member states. And the member states have to use a commonly understood language in their country for the medical field particularly. So now we're back into that. Is it for the medical field or is it for the lay user? And, think about countries like Switzerland that have got so many dialects, they can't even travel from one side of the country to the other side of the country and talk to each other. And then now we also have, so member states have requirements, and the commissions also have requirements to be able to provide translations of documentations into all of the official union language. And then that last part, go back, this is fun, so that documentation can be readily understood by the joint assessment team that does not natively speak all those languages.
Another huge requirement.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And then this is Article 52, sort of boils down to this.
So the member states where the notified body is established may require specific documents related to the proper procedures, and they have to be available in the official language. So that means that your notified body, obviously they have to have their own quality systems and ways of doing things, but they also are going to have to provide those in the official language of these countries.
Great. And one of the things that we're going to focus on in the next set of requirements is what is a certified translation? So in other words, what you'll often hear from folks in procurement or people that are purchasing translations, no problem. We just need a certified translation. So I thought we'd ask, what's a certified translation? So we'll give everyone a few minutes to, no takers on A, I'm actually disappointed. Thank you. That was probably Joe. He did that to amuse me.
I can't take credit for that, no.
Great. All right, we'll give another second or two. But this is interesting. So the winner is D. It's none of the above. Oddly enough,
You
there's
tricked us.
yeah, absolutely. There's actually no such thing as a certified translation.
I feel duped.
Well, it's interesting because it gets thrown around a lot. And, we even use the term, but we use it with confidence because of the steps we follow. I mean, really what you'll hear oftentimes people say, oh, we need an ISO certified firm. Well, I'll tell you what, when our auditor comes in, he actually looks for us to use that term to say we're ISO certified because there is no such thing. ISO never comes in and says, this translation agency is certified. That's not what they do. You're ISO registered. So what they do is they come in and say, you have a quality assurance system that meets the requirements. You are officially ISO registered. But I do think the term's important. But I think it's sort of like beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Sounds
So,
misleading to me.
yeah, well, here's what I would say.
Peter,
Here's what I would say.
you're a nice Catholic boy. I'm surprised at you, to be honest.
Well, what's funny is we see that there's such a demand for it in the market. Like people want to know that they're getting a certified translation. So what we say, it's backed by our quality system. So in other words, we have 3 ISO registrations. It means we invest a lot of time and money into our quality assurance system. So what do we consider a certified translation? And if I were a buyer, I would make sure to define this. So what do I mean by that? Do you have a good system in place? Are you fully transparent with who's working on the project? Are you transparent in the QA steps that you follow? Do you spell it out in any MSA or any quotation that you do? Because one of the things that I often talk about is that pricing should be transparent. The descriptions should be transparent. What I would tell you is if you're doing a 32 language project and someone sends you a proposal and it's a paragraph of text like this with an ellipsis with a really big number to follow, I would run as fast as you can. That's not an appropriate quotation for translation services. What you should see are the steps that they're going to carry out. Is it a human make sure the word human is inserted. Is there a human translator with a second independent editor? And is there a functional review process? Is there desktop publishing? All those steps should be spelled out. It's the same as if you were making any other large investment. You wouldn't buy a house and someone just gave you on a post-it note the price. Here's what I'm building. No, you'd want to see the specs. You'd want to talk about the materials. The same with this. Like, think of it this way. If you're importing into all those countries, let's say it's 32 languages, you're actually going to employ for a short period of time 64 linguists. So think of it, that's a huge thing. You're actually hiring 64 linguists to work with you for, say, a month to get this done. And of course, the translation service provider is the shepherd. You have the project manager that's leading the effort. So I would say just buyer beware on the term certified translation. I think there's a place for it in the market, but just know that there is no governing body that says Argo Translation is certified or XYZ Corp is certified. That doesn't exist. What I would say, define certified for me. You tell me what certified means is what I would ask the vendor.
This is a real sticking point because, I have been asked in audits by notified bodies before, well, show me your certification for this translation. Show me where this is legitimate. And I'm like, and so my mind was blown when Peter said there's really no such thing.
And what they're really
it's like a buzzword.
It's a buzzword.
And what they're misapplied and misinterpreted throughout the industry.
And what they're really looking for is, the way to satisfy the auditor in that case is, I think they really want to see the SOP. So tell me what you're doing for translation. What is your standard operating procedure? And how is the vendor following it? So the way that we do it, and I think others do as well, we don't have the corner on this market. It's just that ours are automatically generated and stored in the system, which is a nice thing for compliance. But we generate a document that lists who the translator was and editor for every single language. We list their years of experience and their level of education, and that's on a report with a sworn statement at the bottom of it with a signature from our project manager. So that's automatically generated with every assignment we do because you know what? It's a pain to pull that information together. So we've automated that process, and that's what that auditor is looking for. So in essence, what that means is that Argo Translation is certifying that this translation is correct and accurate, and we actually use that language. That's essentially what the certification is. It comes from us certifying that we've done all of our due diligence in compliance with our quality assurance program to say that this translation is true and accurate.
What is Michelle to present the next time she gets that question? Show me where this translation is certified. Is there a document that you would send her?
Yes. So I would have, we call it our regulatory compliance platform report. And what it is it lists all that information that I said. And what we've done is we've made it so it fits all the SOPs of our clients. So we've made modifications to it over the years, but they generally look for a few things. They want some form of audit trail to those contributors, education, experience, because some people will put that in their SOP. They say, you know, the translator must have X years of experience. They must have this like some people will go deep into their SOP and
But
list
is
those
it,
requirements.
am I to understand, do you have a template or you customize it for each client?
It's semi-cut. Well, it's a template. We have customized it for clients.
But it's largely 98%.
98% the same.
Okay.
You know, it's the type of document
I want to get
provided
to,
cardiac science.
I believe you have 2 more recommendations for us. I want to ask this question before the top of the hour in case we lose Benjamin, who asks, what languages do we need for the EU, and is there a list?
I think that's going to be a question between Michelle and I think essentially, and actually Luke had a good point on that too, is it has to be the language, the countries in which you sell, right? So obviously, yeah, you can go access the EU and see the current members, and obviously there's been some changes in the last year. But you would look and see which are the member countries, and then you determine from an economic viewpoint of which countries you want to sell in. Michelle, did I say that correctly?
Yeah, and Joe, are you talking about the question where somebody asked about a list?
Mm-hmm.
Once upon a time, I had gotten a list of what each country recognized, but under the MDR, they're going to all have to authorize those languages or revalidate that, yes, we're still going with that language as our primary language. So there is no, and the list I got was like compiled by like Emergo or somebody. It wasn't, there's no like central list that I'm aware of, maybe Luke is, that was published actually by the EU Commission.
I didn't quite follow what you said, that this is the language we're going with for this country.
Yeah, we covered that in some of the earlier slides, that every country has to designate or choose or recognize a language.
Mm-hmm.
Or languages for
it's
its.
not likely to change.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it gets a little bit complex in countries where they speak multiple languages, like a Switzerland or something, you know, where they could designate a different language. You know, that's where I think some of the complexity is as well. Well, you're right. In Italy,
what Luke wrote, he said, the technical level of medical documentation is quite sophisticated. Isn't it hard to find translators that comprehend what they're translating? For example, Estonian. And continues, having to present your documentation to a notified body in their official union language is in practice not that hard. It's the other way around. Like the Netherlands, our notified body only accepts English, not even French documentation.
Interesting. Yeah, you know, yes, but we've been in business a long time, and you know, we sort of hung our hat on medical devices. So we have a really good team. I mean, just to give you an example,
You know who the Estonian guy or gal is.
Right. I mean, that's the trick. You have to build that over time. And really, it's different levels of understanding as well. Like, for example, this is not EU related, but, you know, our lead Chinese translator for medical devices is a non-practicing physician. I can't tell you how many errors she finds in English, because obviously she reads at a different level, challenges things at a different level than even some of our other translators that are, you know, accustomed to working.
You're getting a twofer. You asked me to translate into Chinese, but did you know that your English sucks too?
Oh, I mean, we get a lot of thank yous when she engages on projects, because she often finds things that are in error. So yeah, absolutely. It takes skill to build a team.
I will say you really, for me, you give me a lot of confidence. I really feel as though you are the best.
Oh, well, thank you, Joseph.
Peter walked me through his recruiting process, and it is like intense. There are tests and screenings and questionnaires, and you got to like translate, you know, you got to like live translate stuff. And
yeah, we hired a vendor manager. She's located in Italy, and she's phenomenal. Like, getting through the gauntlet is really tough. And we do have translators that give up, and I think that tells us something. They're not willing to do all the things we're asking them to become part of our team. So it's not easy. We're very loyal to our translators, but it does take a bit of work to get on the team. So it's a great question. I know we're running short on time.
We can run a little over. I'm going to ask Rick's question. He was asking,
Mhm.
He's a design and design services consultant.
Mhm.
Does he have to know about MDR and about translations? I mean, this is interesting for him, but is it integral? Does he need to know this stuff? Do most peripheral consultants need to know MDR and translation?
I mean, I think there are certain aspects that'll touch, depending to the level of work that they're doing. We've got a slide coming up on software, and I think of Joe, the work we did when you were making defibrillators. You've got a small screen. There's small real estate there. So then you have to say to yourself, well, gosh, when we get to those compound nouns in German, how are we going to display these error messages? You have to have a plan to do that, and I think that's where maybe design would come into play. Like, how are we going to do this? And will the device support right to left language? What if we're doing Arabic and Hebrew? So a little bit off of the MDR.
Oh, you just don't think of these things. Wow. Good question, Rick. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah,
okay, let's
very
move to the next recommendation.
All right, outstanding. So just quickly, we talked a little bit about translation memory, but it's incredibly important because now we've talked about packaging. We're about to talk about software. We talked about documentation. So we want to make sure that your vendor is pumping all of these projects into this translation management system. Because guess what? Some of the stuff that Joe wrote as a marketer could potentially leverage some bullet points that were used in documentation or on the website or in an IFU. So we want to make sure that we're speaking consistently about the product across all platforms. And the way to do that is to leverage those assets. So get down into the weeds a little bit and make sure that they're pumping all of the projects, regardless of their format, through the translation management system. All right, so for this next one, this one's simple enough. We didn't abbreviate this one. So this one is about software.
So the user interface of the electronic system has to be available in all official language of the union. So.
And sometimes software is like an afterthought. People are like, well, we got to do our documentation, or the other way around. Sometimes if the engineering team is really pumped on doing their software, then they forget about the documentation. And there's some important stuff here. I mean, you have to understand that there's a dance between the two. Because if you do your software strings, like as a user, nothing is more annoying to me when I'm reading a manual and they say, choose this option, but that option isn't on screen. And that's where there was a disconnect between the engineering team doing the strings and the folks that were writing the documentation. The same exists for translation. So you would want to do your software first, get your database of strings all squared away. Those are pumped into essentially the translation memory. So when the translator's working and that option appears in their sentence that they're translating, they can use what's actually loaded in the software. That's incredibly important. But some of the things quickly that you want to think about here is software can be complex. We talked about, again, not specifically MDR, but we talked about right to left languages. We talked about expansion in German, extended character sets, because there are some extended character sets even in the EU. You'll want to do what's called a pseudo translation pass. So your vendor can take in your string library, just Greek in some translation and program in an expansion factor. So they'll just put in a bunch of gibberish in the characters of that language, give it back to you, let you build the software, and just try to break it. Like, that's a really important pre-flight test. It's something that you should do if you're translating your software.
I'm laughing because you just used the slang term, just Greek it up, and
I know
you're in translation, so Greek is a language. We shouldn't be using that as a verb to just be like gibberish.
I use that one a lot, and my Greek translator told me, do you know what Greek people say? It's all Chinese to me. We say it's all Greek to me, so they say it's all Chinese. So it's funny when they kind of flip that one. But your translation vendor should definitely have the ability to work on a differential, because this is really important with software too, right? This could be a cost sinkhole for you. If your translation vendor is translating the strings over and over again and reinventing the wheel every time, they should be able to work just on that differential and take that responsibility off of your engineering team. Your engineering team shouldn't have to keep red lines and determine which strings. They usually do anyway. But your translation vendor should be able to just say, oh, yep, we're working on the differential. And then the last two important things, string length limitations. Yes, we're going to do German, and there's going to be compound nouns. So tell me if there's, so this is where Rick comes in. Tell me if I have a limit. So is my limit 30 characters? What's my limit on my strings? So this way I can translate to that, or go back to Rick and say, really, you're only giving me as much real estate as the English? That's where we would push back on the design team a little bit and say, hey, this is going into a bunch of different languages. Try to give me at least 25% space to grow my strings, because it's going to happen.
Can you hyphenate a 40-character word in German?
you can, or often you come up with really crazy abbreviations, and that's where, you know, this functional review is important. And whether that functional review is done by someone here at your translation service provider or also by an in-country person, you know, that's important to do that functional, because if we do use abbreviations, will that abbreviation make sense to the end user?
Okay.
All right, and for our last set is Article 89, that sort of boils down to this.
So the manufacturer shall ensure that information about the field safety corrective action taken is brought without delay to the attention of users of the device in question and shall be edited in the official union language. So this means that every time that you take a FSCA, field safety corrective action, that wherever your device was distributed in the European Union, you have to write that FSCA in that language.
Remind me, please, I'm sure you addressed this at the top of the hour. What is common among the articles you chose to discuss today?
Language.
Well, yes, but there were 13 of them. Did we do all 13? Or were these the ones that are particularly tricky?
These are the ones where we have the most recommendations.
Okay, fair enough.
And in fact, I'm sure everybody knows where the MDR is, but in the slides, we'll put a link there in case anyone's looking for it and they can do a deeper dive and want to read an entire article that we went over today, because we sort of packed them down because they're verbose.
Yeah.
So this one's really about speed. I mean, so you know, you're whether it's, you know, internally something comes up in regulatory or an internal audit or something that happens in the marketplace. How are you going to respond and how quickly can you do it? I mean, this is something that you'll want to go over with your translation service provider. Hey, there are times when I need something really fast. How can you do it? What's your reaction time? That's really the important thing here, because those projects will come up, and whether it's relative to an FSCA or even just relative to, hey, we've got something exciting to talk about. You know, Joe and his team in marketing wants to talk about this and they want to talk about it quickly. I can remember doing some real fast projects for Joe for press releases or things that were important to his team. So you'll just want to go over speed. That's really the main recommendation here.
And I recommend that you write it into your contract with your translation provider, because you're going to have only a limited amount of time to get back to, depending on the nature of the adverse event, you're only going to have so many days to notify the competent authorities.
Really good point. That concludes the presentation, and
which I will make available in the MDG Premium channel called Our Weekly Calls. And the recording will be up, should be by Monday in the archive. Next week, we are going to stay on the MDR theme, courtesy of Rob, who is going to move up his presentation about what MDR is going to do to your submissions. And as I said earlier, it warms me to see my friends come together and put something together like this. I really enjoyed this hour. Peter, you make translations fun. I mean, who would have thought? I'll also say that I have fallen behind in scheduling the out months. So if there are folks on the call who have something that they'd like to present, Fridays starting June are open, and I'll be looking to pack that calendar. Also, for your much longer calendar, I am beginning to talk with my support team about getting together in the same building for 10X in 2022, and it'll be long overdue for some folks to get hugged. I'm looking at you, Andre. Luke writes, even with my Alzheimer's, I remember a great talk Peter gave last year on the same subject. We PM'd on the possibility of using IKEA-style instructions for use without words, which is very similar to what Jorg wrote, that we're doing a lot of UI work in design. UIs have moved to be much more icon-based. What is your association with icons? Is there a translation? I mean, do you have memory of, you know, this means this, you know, I remember there's a book about, you know, when you go to China, don't do this because it means something entirely different than thumbs up or whatever. That's not the example, but are you involved in that?
Sure, we've done that. We see it more often with websites. You know, people will want to talk about what's appropriate in terms of imagery on websites, pictures, things that may or may not be offensive. We haven't done a lot with iconography in terms of using that as UI. Oddly enough, even as a translation guy, I'm okay with it. Like a lot of people will say, oh, but doesn't that, hurt your business? And I really don't think so. I think it just creates more connection. I mean, wherever you can create more connection, you're going to get more business in country, and it's just going to be more work. And I think in the end, if it's simpler and it makes sense to the user, I'm all for it.
You can't write your CER summary with icons. So like that's just such a small portion of the documents that are going to have to be translated.
That's a great point, Michelle. And it makes sense. I mean, for certain devices, it probably makes more sense to use icons. I get it. But yeah, right. Of course, you're still going to have all the regulatory documentation. And I'm sure the material that goes to the clinician or the physician, you probably can't give them a bunch of icons. That probably
I
won't
would like to meet your wing-ding translator.
Yes, we're working on recruiting that person, actually.
Okay, I'm sure it's very stringent. Peter, Michelle, thank you so much. Great
Thank
session
you.
today. And we'll see you all next week.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Joe.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.